Ever since the death of George Floyd, the Black Lives Movement has picked up so much steam and momentum. It's really remarkable. I've never seen anything quite like this in my life. There are so many voices speaking out against injustice and oppression and racism. And I wanted to learn more. I wanted to understand this movement and this issue as much as I could, and I started actually looking into it, researching and studying maybe up to 40 different sources. And from that, it was a lot of information, and so I compiled it into 30 things that I've learned about racism, kind of created my own racism encyclopedia. And so it's been really helpful for me to take all that information and boil it down, organize it, and I thought it might help you to be able to see some of the highlights that I've picked out from a lot of these different things. And so I want to share with you in this video 30 things I now know about racism, grouped into 3 different groups. The first one is 10 different facts. So here it is. Fact number 1. By 2044, white people will make up less than 50% of the American population, which is going to change everything we know about majority and minority races. Number 2. Despite the diversity in our communities, the average white person of the average white person's friends, 9% are not white. Number 3, America has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the imprisoned population. Number 4, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Certain conditions continue to exist in our society which must be condemned as vigorously and as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard." Number 5, African American, Hispanic, and Native Americans on average have a household income of about $20,000 less than white Americans. Number 6, evangelical icons like Billy Graham, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards were pretty much moderates when it came to slavery and segregation, and didn't do a whole lot to fight against those injustices. Number 7, of the about 10 million slaves who were brought to America, 1/3 died in the first 3 years. Number 8, even though Rosa Parks is known for being an elderly woman with weak knees, she in fact was a young black radical activist, which is not as easy for us to come to terms with. Number 9, whiteness is a social construct that was created during slavery. And number 10 is a little different. Number 10 is this. My history books left out a few details. In 1492, Columbus did not discover America. In fact, America was already discovered by millions of people. Another fact is from 1882 to 1968, 4,753 lynchings occurred in the United States. And one other fact is that 120,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned after Pearl Harbor. So we need to be a little more honest with our history. So those were 10 facts. Now we're going to go into 10 different terms, and I'm going to explain the terms a little bit. So number 1, people of color. So people of color, the term refers to people who are not white, which I'm sure a lot of you guys already knew. I knew that, but I didn't realize that the term people of color is different than colored people. I thought they were interchangeable until I said colored people, and someone got back to me and said, actually, one term is respecting people. The other actually conjures up images from Jim Crow days and segregation, and is very disrespectful. So avoid using the term colored people. Number 2, colorblind. You know, for me, I always thought to be colorblind was the ultimate goal, especially for a white person, was to come to a place where you didn't really notice your differences and your color, that you just saw people as people. And there's something about that seems so appealing, but it actually does cause a lot of problems because, for one, if there really are issues with racism, how are you going to address them if we're not talking about races? And also, how are we going to appreciate different people's cultural strengths and the good things people bring out of their diversity if we don't actually recognize the diversity? So this issue can be so damaging that politicians would actually use colorblindness to their advantage. Lee Atwater, he was a campaign consultant, and he helped politicians to become savvy, to use the colorblind language to leverage racism for their own advantage. He says, you start out in 1954 by saying the N-word. By 1968, you can't say the N-word. That hurts. It hurts you, it backfires, so you say stuff like forced busing or states' rights and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes and all these things that you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is this. Blacks get hurt worse than whites. You see, being colorblind really hurts us so many times, and it doesn't help us see solutions. And so I like what Derwin Gray says. He says, we're not color blind, we're color blessed. Number 3, white privilege. I want to bring up this term white privilege because it conjures up in me, or at least it used to. It was a really hard one for me to swallow. I really like this definition from Ken Wistrom. White privilege doesn't mean your life isn't hard. It means that if you are a person of color, simply by virtue of that, your life might be harder. So I really like that definition because I used to really not like the term white privilege. I grew up poor on food stamps. I grew up and I was, evicted from my houses, stuff like that, and I thought there wasn't any privilege in me. I thought of that as sort of ignoring the different challenges I was going through and being sort of a reason why I wasn't getting as much help or support as I could have gotten, like scholarships and things like that. But this definition says that it doesn't mean that you don't go through challenges if you're white. It means you don't go through challenges because you're white, or at least the same challenges that people of color are going through. Saying white privilege just means that you are given some sort of advantage because you're white. And I think that's really important for us to come to terms with. Number 4, redlining. Redlining refers to the practice of banks to withhold loans and insurance from people of color in certain neighborhoods. And so there's a lot that can be said about this. There's a lot written about redlining. This is a new concept to me. But the one thing I really want to point out about this is that this was a system that was in place that was explicitly, obviously racist and organized and legal, that was in place after the civil rights movement. Because in my mind, I had this myth that the civil rights movement destroyed every single kind of racism that was that kind of explicit, obvious racism. I thought that was done after the civil rights movement, and it was just a different kind of shade of racism. Well, something still lingered, even to that degree. Number 5, white fragility. White fragility. Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, is probably the most mentioned book on racism today. I hear it all the time. And so I want to show you her definition of white fragility. She defines it as disbelieving defensiveness that white people exhibit when their ideas about race and racism are challenged, and particularly when they feel implicated in white supremacy. I think so many times this book is brought up because it's pretty controversial. And I think in some ways it doesn't help the conversation continue. What she's doing is she's pointing out that there are people who don't like talking about race. They don't like feeling guilty when they're white and, whatever it may be. They don't like the uncomfortable feeling. And so she says, well, a lot of times you get mad because you're fragile, and that doesn't always help the conversation move forward. But what she's saying has some great merit. And so I want to draw attention to the fact that something that we as white people, need to know is when we're talking to people of color, they may feel uncomfortable talking about issues of race. They may feel uncomfortable talking about their experiences or their opinions because us white people don't always give them the easiest time. It may not be a safe place for them to share about these things. And so I've got to be a lot more sensitive to that. Also, she makes another point that I thought was so great. She says, when we define the idea that racism as conscious bias held by mean people, when we do that, it's causing a lot of harm. What I mean by that is that when you think of racism, if all that your mind can go to is evil, mean people, and then what you do is you can justify yourself and say, I've got nothing to learn, I've got nothing to do, I have arrived, I'm not really there because I'm not that. And that can get really damaging because we do have a responsibility to act. We do have to do something. We are responsible to bring about justice. All right, that was white fragility. Number 6, white supremacy. White supremacy. When you think of white supremacy, I bet you think of very angry, very mean, violent people wanting to kill other people. And you think, okay, I am not a white supremacist by any means. But the definition isn't quite that. The definition of white supremacy is simply the belief that white people are superior. And even then, you'd probably say, no, that's not me. I am not a white supremacist. I think that all races are equal. I do not think that white people are superior. Well, I'm sure you're right, but one thing we got to be aware of is that we are being impacted by our environment and by our history. We've got to understand that hundreds of years of white supremacy, hundreds of years where the majority belief was that the minorities were inferior, hundreds of years of that doesn't just go away from a few changes of the law. So those kinds of beliefs are still being passed down in some way 60 years later. They still show up in some ways. And they're still visible in our environment, in our culture, in our media that point to white people being superior. In fact, they've actually shown through different studies that unconsciously we tend to group white people as good and black people as bad. They've even shown that a lot of black people group white people as good and black people as bad and in a subconscious level. Why is that? Because so much of our environment tends to skew in that way. Let me give you an example. The movie Blind Side, I know it's a little dated, but that movie is a great example because on the surface, it looks like it is anything but racist. It's a nice white family taking in a black teen and helping him to succeed in life. But if you look at the different characters in the movie, you can see that for the most part, the white characters are wealthy, they're put together, they're smart, educated, nice, generous people. And the black characters in the movie are, for the most part, not as smart, they're not as wealthy, they're not as educated, they really struggle to get by. A lot of them are portrayed as being violent or drug abusers, struggling in life, can't even really communicate or function in this world. And that is just one movie that really highlights this whole idea of white supremacy. It does. It shows white people as being superior to black people. It doesn't really give a fair case for great things in black culture. Number 7, the term Black Lives Matter. I want to talk about that whole expression because it's really seen in two different ways. There's the organization or the political side of Black Lives Matter, and there's just the simple value statement that Black Lives Matter. In an interview with Carrie Nieuwhof, Albert Tate argues that it's actually a statement of value, opposed to a political statement. He says that when you're saying Black Lives Matter, you're saying our brothers and sisters who are black, their lives matter, and our world should function in a way that says that that's true. In the same interview, Kay Warren says this. She says, "I'm willing to risk being misunderstood by some in order that I might be seen as an advocate and a friend to my brothers and sisters that are hurting." And I love that attitude. She's willing to be misunderstood. She's facing all kinds of criticism, and she says, that's okay, because I would much rather stand with those who are hurting. Number 8, law and order. Law and order. Again, this is a term that you're pretty familiar with, and on the surface, it's pretty obvious. Law and order means, we're keeping our streets safe. We're going to bring criminals to justice. But what you may not know about is there is a nuance to the term law and order where politicians have used that expression and have had underlying racial issues with that. The documentary 13th argues that this expression was used politically to appeal to white people who saw black people as dangerous and wanted to lock them up. And so when you hear that term, law and order, you want to be aware of those sorts of connotations that that expression conjures up. Number 9, complicity. Complicity. In the book, The Color of Compromise, Jemar Tisby convincingly argues that Christian leaders in the Christian church, for the most part, has had so many opportunities to bring about justice throughout slavery, throughout segregation, and so many times the Christian church has remained silent. And I'll tell you, more than anything else I read or heard, this struck a chord with me because these are Christian leaders who were heroes to me, and they still are heroes to me for how much they proclaim the gospel. They said that the gospel is vitally important for the salvation of souls, and we are going to take that seriously. But what ended up happening is that the gospel became exclusive. And when we talked about social justice issues, that was seen as a distraction. And so many people who had a platform, who had influence, who could have made a difference much sooner, who could have spoken up, remained silent. And that is what Tisby calls Christian complicity. Number 10, justice. Justice. The Bible Project does this great job producing a video on justice, and in it they ask the question, why is it as human beings that we are so drawn toward justice? We want to see justice so badly. And you look in the other, animal kingdom, and they don't care so much as we do about seeing wrongs right and to see justice upheld. What's going on here? Well, early in the Bible, it describes human beings as being made in God's image. And because of that, we have a right as human beings to be treated fairly and with dignity. And when we don't see that, that creates a huge burden in us. And so we as Christians, if you're a Christian, that means you have a theological imperative to seek for justice. All right, so that was 10 facts and 10 terms. I don't just want to leave you with information. I want to help you think about what are some things you can do even right now. What are 10 steps you can take to fighting injustice? What can you do? Number 1, become more aware. Keep learning, keep discovering. There's a lot of resources out there. Number 2, keep the conversation going. I'll tell you, for me, it was a friend of mine who was talking to me about racial issues, and he was talking to me in a way that didn't put me on the defense, that helped me learn and grow so much. Number 3, be slow to anger. I love what James, the brother of Jesus, says. He says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to be angry. And then he goes on to say that the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And that's what we're going for. This is our goal, is we want to see the righteousness of God. We want to see justice right here, right now. And so what James is saying is, if you really do want to see the righteousness of God, it's not going to happen if all you do is get mad. So there is a time to get mad, But we have to be slow to anger, because the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Number 4, we need to learn to lament. Right after the death of George Floyd, I was in a meeting and it was kind of business as normal, and I could see that people were pretty quiet, and I kind of asked, hey, what's on your mind? And someone brought up George Floyd, and they talked about how we need to be talking more about racial issues. And I'll never forget what one person in the group said. She said, right now, our country is experiencing what could be described like a funeral. And I thought that was so helpful for me to understand that that is the tone we need to move forward in so much. And so many times for me, I want to look for those quick fixes, but that's not what you do at a funeral. At a funeral, you weep. At a funeral, you grieve. At a funeral, where you remember and you support one another. You don't always look for quick fixes at a funeral. Number 5, show support. Show support to people who are hurting. This may be sending a text saying, I'm thinking of you, I'm praying for you. This may be posting something to show that people saying, I'm there with you, I support you, I understand what you're going through, and it's real. It may be going to a demonstration or protest, and by going there, you're not saying, I hate police officers, but what you're saying is that I know that my friends are hurting, and I want to stand with them, and I want to see some resolution come about and some justice formed. Number 6, practice the platinum rule. You may have heard of the golden rule, which says, do to others as you would have them do to you. But there is one step further we could go. We could go to the platinum rule, which says, do to others as they would have you do to them. The reason why this matters is because we all have different ways we want to be treated. Let me give you an example. You may want people to call you by your first name because that's very familiar, that's casual, that's friendly. But someone else may want to be called by their title and their last name because that shows respect. Is one better than another? No. But so many times we think everyone thinks the same way as us and everyone prefers to be treated the same way we do. And we got to slow down and have the cultural awareness to be sensitive to what other people prefer and what other people need. So the platinum rule. Number 7, use your platform to elevate minorities. I love what our friend Alicia is doing. She's an art teacher and she's using her role to teach her students stuff that they wouldn't normally learn in class. Typically they talk about European art, but she's using her platform to introduce her students to artists of different backgrounds. Number 8, try to view people who are different from you as family and friends. Miles McPherson talks about the different labels we put on people, and so many times when we put on labels to people, it helps justify dehumanizing people. So we need to avoid labeling people as just criminals, illegals, racists, whatever it may be, the N-word. We want to avoid those labels and see people as brothers and sisters, as neighbors, as people we are connected to, as people we love. Number 9, expose yourself to minorities who are positive and making a big difference. So there was a study done that actually shows our unconscious bias for or against different races. But one way we can actually change that is actually exposing ourselves to be watching and viewing really positive minorities. And number 10, do a friend inventory. Do a friend inventory. Remember I said that 9% of a white person's friends are not white. Well, look at your friends and think about how can I change that in my friend group to have friends with people who are different from me. So I know I put a lot out there. I said a lot of information. Thank you so much for sticking with me to the end. But I really want to challenge you not just to watch this and walk away, but to consider what is one action step you will do after watching this video. Okay, in our Anchor channel, we want to continue to provide you with help in your walk with God or your life and your faith. We want to help you grow. And so if you're interested in that, we would love it if you subscribe to our channel. And with that said, thank you again for watching. We'll see you next time.